On October 20th, 2015, the defendant, Christopher Strawn, shot the victim, Brandon Cook, in the back of the head with a 12-gauge shotgun, killing him instantly. This is Brandon Cook. I expect that you will hear that Brandon had moved to Juneau from Oklahoma. He lived here for a couple of years and he worked 2 jobs. While he lived here, he worked as a manager at Safeway, and he worked handling cargo at Alaska Airlines. Prior to that, he worked at Walmart. When he worked at Walmart, he had met a young lady. At the time, her name was Tiffany Albertson. She has since married, and her name is now Tiffany Johnson. I expect that you will hear her testify that she and Brandon, in the time that they worked together at Walmart, became very close friends. I expect that you'll hear Ms. Johnson describe Mr. Cook as someone who is like a brother to her. They spent time with each other as friends. They knew each other's significant others. They knew each other's family. They looked to each other for help. They looked to each other for the kind of help that you look to a brother or a sister for. Brandon, Mr. Cook, for example, would ask Ms. Johnson to help jump his truck on occasion. For her part, Ms. Johnson sought Mr. Cook's help when she bought her first home. She bought that home in early October of 2015. It was located in Kodzoff Acres, and she bought it from a company called Alpha Diversified, which sells and rents properties around town, mostly in the trailer park neighborhoods. Her residence was Kodzoff C16, and I think she will describe to you that when she bought that property, it was a mess. It was not a place where a person could live with their family. She has 2 children. I think she'll testify that she had concerns about their safety in that residence. There was a lot of work that needed to be done. And when she needed to do that work, she turned to Mr. Cook, because they had the kind of relationship where they seek each other for help. There was garbage that needed to be taken to the dump. It was in general disrepair. There was an enormous hole in the kitchen right where one would stand to do the dishes that made it impossible to stand there. She intended to live there, as I indicated, with her 2 children and her then fiance, who she has since married. But before they could move in, this work needed to be done. She contacted Shirley McCoy, who was the person that she'd worked with in order to buy the property. Ms. McCoy works for Alpha Diversified. And she and Ms. McCoy worked out an arrangement. Tiffany would do the work herself. Ms. Johnson would do the work herself. Ms. McCoy would reimburse her for the costs necessary and would ensure that Ms. Johnson was being paid for her time. And Ms. McCoy also introduced Ms. Johnson to a person who could help her. This person was a stranger to Ms. Johnson. She'd never met him before. He was something of a day laborer, and his name was Christopher Strawn, the defendant in this case. Ms. Johnson spent several hours with him over the days, cleaning the trailer, making plans for the remodel. She paid him some money to assist her, not just for his time, but also for supplies. She met him in early October of 2015, which was around the time that she closed on the property, which was about October 6th, I think you'll hear from the testimony. In the time that she'd worked with Mr. Strawn, she had spoken with him about his life. She'd met his father on one occasion when there was a problem with her furnace. She'd spent time with him, she knew him, she recognized him. She knew what he drove. She knew what his dog looked like. She knew the defendant and she could identify him. On October 20th, 2015, they were working together. I believe Ms. Johnson will testify that she'd spent a day sort of running around. She'd been caring for her kids in the morning, waiting for childcare to come so that she could start running errands, to pick up supplies, to get over to the property, to start the day's work. I expect you'll hear Ms. Johnson testify that she received a request from Mr. Cook in that evening as she was running around to help him, to jump his truck. He'd been at work at Safeway, his truck had died. So Ms. Johnson left what she was doing at the residence. She left Mr. Strawn there. He had been working on that day on October 20th, 2015 in her residence. She left him there. She went over to Safeway. What she found was that she ultimately couldn't jump his truck because her car wasn't compatible with it. It happens. So instead, they found another person to help him out. They got his truck started, and both of them in two separate vehicles went to Ms. Johnson's house to get working. I think she'll testify that this was in the evening hours, somewhere between 7 and 9 p.m. So it was a pretty late start for the working day. The defendant, Mr. Strawn, was already there. I believe that you will hear testimony that Mr. Strawn and Mr. Cook had not known each other prior to this occasion, these times that they worked together in assistance of Ms. Johnson. And they all had their separate tasks. They were working on painting in the living room area. You'll see photographs of the residence. You'll see that as you walk in the front door, to the right was the kitchen area, and it was an open floor plan that kind of led into the living space. And I think you'll hear testimony that Ms. Johnson was painting in the kitchen area. Mr. Cook was helping her. And Mr. Strawn was doing other various tasks not related to the painting. Tiffany, I believe, or Ms. Johnson will testify that over the course of the day, the defendant had been behaving strangely. He seemed anxious to her. There had been some discussion over a piece of garbage that they'd removed from the house, a sign that involved had a religious meaning that Tiffany intended to throw out, and he had called to her attention. She made note of that because Mr. Strawn, she'll testify, had asked them over the course of the day about their belief in God and their belief in a higher power. I believe Ms. Johnson will testify to you that they'd had a conversation about Mr. Cook and Ms. Johnson and Mr. Strawn's various faiths and their belief in God. And I believe that Ms. Johnson will testify to you that Mr. Strawn left over the course of that day 3 times. The first time he left quickly and he returned quickly. Ms. Johnson doesn't know where he went. The second time, Ms. Johnson, I believe, will testify that he drove away in his truck. He drove a truck with a bed cover on it that was parked at her residence and later found there. Ms. Johnson, I believe, will testify that after the second time he left, he came back acting particularly strangely, continued this talk about God and their faith. And it made both Ms. Johnson and Mr. Cook uncomfortable. They began to talk about cleaning up quickly. They were eager to get out of there. They wanted to get out of that situation. They didn't want to have any more interactions with Mr. Strawn. So they started cleaning up. Brandon went to the kitchen sink. He was standing over the sink, rinsing a paint sprayer that they'd been using to paint the living room. Ms. Johnson was finishing up the work that she was doing in the living room with a paint roller, just finishing the last piece of painting that she was doing. This was the 3rd time that Mr. Strawn left the residence. This time was brief. Tiffany was turned away from Mr. Cook. She was facing the wall where she was painting. Mr. Cook was facing the sink. Mr. Strawn, the defendant, entered the residence. This time he was armed with a shotgun. Tiffany, who wasn't facing him, heard him say, "Fuck it, there is no God." And she heard him shoot Brandon once, and she turned, and she saw her friend as he went down, fell backward to the floor. As Ms. Johnson observed the defendant, she saw him. She recognized him. She saw and observed and internalized that he was wearing black pants and a black jacket. She saw that he was holding a shotgun that appeared to be shorter than normal, but it wasn't shorter in the barrel. It was shorter in the grip, and he was holding it like it was a pistol. Although it was a shotgun, he was holding it as though it was a pistol. And she observed that Brandon was clearly dead. There was no question in her mind that Mr. Strawn had killed him. And she worried too that she would be next. So she, hysterical, ran to the only hiding place available in this otherwise empty trailer. I think you will hear testimony that this hiding space was inadequate for the task. It was an open closet in the back room. It had no door. She had no real place to hide because the trailer had been stripped of everything. She called 911. She hid there hysterical. You will hear this call. And she did not know, in those approximately 20 minutes, while she waited for JPD to arrive and to lead her from the residence, she did not know whether the defendant was gone or whether he would return for her. And in her panic, she waited, hysterical, crying, terrified, until JPD arrived. And you'll hear testimony from them that that was the condition she was in when they led her out of the residence, terrified for her life. And you will hear testimony from JPD that they found Mr. Cook in a pool of his own blood, having been shot at close range in the back of the head. And we know it was at close range because this was a 12-gauge shotgun. The wadding that is contained in a shotgun shell remained in the back of his head because it would, although it would normally fall away at a distance, he was shot so close to his head that it had no time to fall away, and the wadding remained lodged there. Ms. Johnson immediately identified Mr. Strawn to be the suspect. His truck remained, and all the corroborating evidence, I believe you will hear, supported that report. His truck was in her driveway. All of her tools were around her house. She described him as being the shooter. She gave a detailed explanation of what they had been doing and what he was wearing. And he lived nearby. He lived approximately a mile away at the Glacier View Trailer Park, number 35. So JPD immediately went out and started looking. They conducted a canvass of the area to see if any other neighbors, anyone else in the area had heard anything, seen anything, heard anyone, seen anyone. They immediately started searching the area between the two trailers. They knew he hadn't driven away. His truck was still there. In between these two trailer parks is a trail surrounded by ponds. They walked that trail. They didn't find anybody. They immediately placed a surveillance on Mr. Strawn's trailer, 35 Glacier View. But to no avail did they find him on that trail. All the searching, they did not find the weapon he had used until the next day when they searched his home. The next morning they searched Mr. Strawn's home and they found clothing consistent with that described by Ms. Johnson. They found a black jacket, they found black pants, and it was wet and muddy, consistent with a person having crossed a wet and muddy trail between two trailer parks. They found boots that had tread consistent with footprints that were found approximately 10 feet away from the spot at which Mr. Cook was fatally shot. They found 12-gauge Winchester shotgun shells all over the residence, everywhere. They found, most importantly, 2 buttstock pieces. That is to say, pieces of the buttstock of a shotgun, consistent with, you'll hear testimony from a firearms expert who will testify that those buttstocks consistent with a Savage Stevens model 67E shotgun which fires a 12-gauge shot. The autopsy of Mr. Cook later revealed that the wadding and the pellets collected from the back of his head were consistent with a 12-gauge shotgun shell. The pellets they collected were particularly appropriate and consistent with the ammunition located in the defendant's home, the ammunition which is of the type that could be fired from a Savage Stevens Model 67E shotgun. Those buttstock pieces were missing, consistent with Ms. Johnson's description that the firearm was short in the buttstock, not in the barrel. Now, you'll hear testimony that JPD searched those woods over and over and over again. I think that at least 4 officers will testify that they searched the ponds, they searched the trail, they searched under the bushes, and they found nothing. You will hear testimony that we never found the firearm that killed Mr. Cook. And we may never find that shotgun. We know who took his life. And that person is Christopher Strawn. And at the conclusion of this trial, I'm going to ask you to find him guilty for doing so. Thank you.